J.D. Vance walked into that room with one document, just one. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't marked top secret. But inside were 23 names, CEOs. Each one had received over $6 million from a relief bill that was supposed to rescue the American people, while factory workers got $600, while veterans skipped meals to keep the lights on. He didn't pound the table. He didn't shout. He stood there, on live television, 10 feet from President Biden, and he read one name, then another, until the applause died, until the camera crew stopped blinking, until the room sat in silence. Because in that moment, the numbers stopped being numbers. They became proof. And the only question that mattered was, if you had that list, would you read it too? This isn't a news report, it's a story, imagined in its form, but rooted in feelings many know too well. While the moments are fictional, but the emotions it reflects, the quiet anger, the need for fairness, the courage to speak when no one else will, are deeply, undeniably real. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. President Biden stood behind the podium that morning with quiet confidence, flanked by flags and flares of camera flashes. His voice was steady, familiar, almost fatherly. America, he announced with a smile, is back on its feet. Applause broke out among his staff and officials in the room. The moment was carefully staged, crafted for headlines and evening news soundbites. Across the nation, the message was repeated like gospel. The American Prosperity Restoration Act had done its job. Relief had reached the people. The economy was bouncing back. But in Chillicothe, Ohio, a different sound echoed, the final whistle of mid-river manufacturing, blowing for the last time. That same morning, J.D. Vance sat in the back row of the Senate chamber, still and quiet, as another senator spoke about economic resilience and post-pandemic optimism. On the surface, it was business as usual. But then his phone buzzed once. He glanced down. A message lit up the screen. Urgent mid-river closing. 342 jobs gone. For good. He didn't react outwardly, but something in his eyes shifted. His grip on the armrest tightened just slightly. Around him, the chamber droned on, detached from the world outside. No one mentioned Chillicothe. No one seemed to know or care that a factory built on 3 generations of labor had just gone silent. Back home, the closure wasn't just news. It was personal. For some families, mid-river had been the only job anyone had ever known. A handwritten sign taped to the vending machine in the break room read, "America's back on its feet? We must have missed it." Another worker, folding his uniform one last time, said softly to the room, "I guess they mean someone else's feet." J.D. had been to that factory. He'd shaken those hands. He remembered the way the foreman once described his crew. "We don't ask for much, just not to be forgotten." But that's exactly what it felt like now. Forgotten. That afternoon, Biden wrapped up his press event and stepped off the stage, satisfied with the sound bites. One of the reporters caught a faint exchange between him and an aide. "That should shut them up in the Rust Belt for a while," he said under his breath. The microphone was still hot. The clip never made it to mainstream coverage, but it would be shared again and again in the very towns he was talking about. J.D. returned to his office and pulled up the weekly reports. Another factory in West Virginia, a meatpacking plant in Indiana, a textile shop in central Pennsylvania. Towns going dark, one by one, without a single headline. And then, buried inside Mid-River's closure report, he noticed something strange. Line 27. Federal aid pending. Final decision, shut down. Bonuses issued. Bonuses? He stared at it. That word clung in the air like a warning. Someone, somewhere, had received a reward for pulling the plug. He hadn't seen that detail in the official briefings. Not yet. He turned to the desk. A folder waited for him. Thick, sealed, marked. Relief package oversight. Internal review. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. And across town, in the place where sirens used to wail and steal, one screamed. Someone had taken a can of red paint and sprayed 5 words across the locked gates of Mid-River Manufacturing. "Where's our feet, Mr. Biden?" 2 days later, J.D. Vance sat in a high-ceilinged, wood-paneled conference room, deep within the Capitol. The private hearing for the Senate Budget Committee had been called on short notice, closed to the press, light on agenda and heavier on posture than policy. Most members saw it as a formality, a box to check before heading off to pre-scheduled fundraisers and interviews. For JD, it was a chance to listen, to watch the way people moved when they thought no one was watching. The topic was the Post-Relief Funding Report, a 45-minute session filled with charts, euphemisms, and verbal camouflage. Words like temporary misalignment, forecast-based projections, and short-term liquidity redistribution floated around the table like smoke. JD barely blinked. He scribbled quietly, nodded when appropriate, but said nothing. The Undersecretary for Budget Transparency gave a final shrug, more performative than sincere, and closed his binder. The chair adjourned the meeting with the usual murmur of thanks and a promise to circle back in Q3. Staffers gathered their notes in practiced haste. The room emptied quickly, voices rising just outside the door. JD remained in his chair, calm and unhurried. That's when it happened. A young aide, flustered, likely on his third job in 18 months, stumbled while gathering a pile of folders and dropped one. It landed near JD's foot with a dull thunk. Thick, worn, stamped with a red diagonal label. Confidential. Executive Allocation Summary. Internal use only. The aide muttered an apology and reached for it. JD was already bending forward. Their eyes met briefly. His calm, the aide's panicked, and then JD spoke for the first time that session. "Mind if I take a look at this one?" he asked evenly. The aide hesitated. That's not part of the committee's copy set, Senator." JD offered a small nod. "All right, just curious." The aide smiled awkwardly, gathered the rest of his folders, and shuffled out. But the folder, the thick manila one, remained. JD watched the door until it clicked shut. Then, without hurry, he picked up the folder, opened it, and flipped to the first page. Rows of numbers, names, columns labeled Relief Disbursement Tier A, Adjusted Executive Discretion Bonus, and Allocation Override Phase 2. His finger moved down the list. The names weren't unfamiliar. CEOS lobbying firm partners, private defense contractors. Several had testified before Congress in recent years. A few had shared panels with White House officials. Each entry ended with a number, 6, sometimes 7 digits, under a column marked Relief Approved. One name caught his eye. Thatcher James W., Steel Corp Holdings, $6,250,000. JD's brow furrowed. Steel Corp was one of the parent companies connected to Mid-River Manufacturing, the one that had just closed. He turned another page, and another. None of this had been in the summaries presented to the public. Without ceremony, JD slid the folder into his briefcase and quietly zipped it shut. No one saw him leave the room. No one asked where the folder had gone. Back in his office, the sounds of the Capitol moved on as usual. Elevators, heels on marble, echoes of the familiar. But for JD Vance, something had shifted. The applause, the speeches, the slogans, all of it had suddenly gone hollow. There were numbers here that didn't just raise questions. They drew lines between those who were lifted and those who were left behind. And somewhere at the bottom of this folder, JD had a feeling he would find out exactly who was making those decisions and why no one had ever intended for him to see it. It was nearly midnight by the time JD Vance got home. The city outside his townhouse had quieted. Washington's usual frenzy softened into the hush of sleeping bureaucrats and glowing streetlights. The hallway was dim, the air still. JD didn't turn on the television. He didn't loosen his tie. He didn't even take off his shoes. Instead, he went straight to his desk, opened the briefcase, and pulled out the manila folder that had been burning in the back of his mind since the moment it hit the floor. He opened it slowly. The pages were dense, typed in government gray, tables and footnotes, departmental seals. But it wasn't the formatting that made his heart sink. It was the pattern. Column after column, row after row, dollar amounts, payout codes, and above all, names. Most of them didn't need introductions. Some were familiar from finance hearings. Others he recognized from campaign donor lists. A few had stood on stages next to the president in recent years, praising innovation, growth, stability. JD read line by line. Thomas L. Gentry, Stratline Capital, $5,850,000 Maria Hale. Hale Tech Lobbying Group, $3,120,000. Douglas and Reed Consulting, disbursement Tier A, $4,775,000. He paused, blinked, looked back at the front page. The top of the file was marked Executive Allocation Summary, Internal Use Only. Below that, in smaller print, authorized under Emergency Discretionary Clause, 14B of APR Act, Non-Reviewable Disbursement Channel. He kept reading. Crossfield Energy, $6.9 million. Walden Strategic Partners, $7.3 million. And then he saw it. Thatcher James W. Steel Corp Holdings, $6,250,000. The name hit like a quiet blow to the chest. JD leaned back in his chair, staring at the line. He read it again. Steel Corporation, parent company of Mid-River Manufacturing, the factory that just shut down in his district. 800 jobs gone. No severance, no warning. Only silence and spray paint on locked gates. He remembered the text he'd received that morning. Urgent Mid-River closing. 342 gone. Permanently. That wasn't the whole number. It was just the first wave. They hadn't even counted the contractors. Or the families. And now here it was. $6.2 million. Quietly routed to the same man who signed the closure papers. A bonus. Labeled as relief. He felt a pressure rising behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of heavy clarity. Something had broken open. This wasn't just a policy mistake. It wasn't bad math or bureaucratic delay. It was deliberate, structured, legal maybe, but designed to be invisible. There were no names from Chillicothe on this list. No machinists, no widows, no school janitors or part-time waitresses. No one who ever got their hands dirty. Only insiders, donors, people who never missed a gala. JD read on. Another name, another number. They began to blur, but he couldn't stop. Each page deepened the pit in his stomach. This was the list the headlines never mentioned. This was what was happening behind the press conferences. While the president spoke of recovery, these names had already been paid. And the rest, well, they were expected to clap from a distance and carry on. JD closed the folder. His fingers lingered on the cover. He didn't yet know what he'd do with it, but he knew he couldn't unsee it. Somewhere across the city, speeches were being drafted for next week's summit. Somewhere, another factory was one decision away from shutting its doors. And somewhere inside this folder was the blueprint, not of a rescue, but of a betrayal dressed in paperwork. The next morning, J.D. Vance stepped onto the sidewalk outside his childhood post office in Chillicothe, Ohio. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that never quite cleared, but didn't have the nerve to rain either. Everything about the town felt paused, like it was waiting for someone to say something honest, out loud. He hadn't made an announcement. No press, no cameras, just a quiet visit to the place that had taught him, in both brutal and beautiful ways, what it meant to survive. Word had spread anyway. By the time he reached the edge of the hardware store parking lot, a small line had already formed. Not a crowd, just a handful of people standing still, clutching envelopes in one hand and dignity in the other. The first was an old man in a fraying denim jacket. His hands were rough and cracked, fingernails permanently smudged with grease that wouldn't wash out, no matter how many years had passed since his last shift at the mill. He didn't say hello, just handed JD a folded note and looked him square in the eye. "We got $600, the note read. "My mortgage is $700. JD nodded once and slipped the paper into the inside pocket of his coat. The next was a young mother with 2 children, one on her hip, one hiding behind her coat sleeve. Her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the effort of holding back too much at once. She handed JD a letter, hand-scrawled on the back of a gas bill envelope. "They called it a rescue," it said. "We're still drowning." He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. The letters kept coming, one from a man whose wife had worked 22 years at Mid-River. She hadn't told her kids she'd been laid off, just put on a uniform each morning and left the house so they wouldn't see the shame. One from a grandmother who now shared her single Social Security check with 3 generations living under one roof. One from a high school student delivering pizzas 6 nights a week to help his dad keep their trailer's electricity on. JD read them all, quietly, carefully. He folded each note and tucked it into a leather folder he carried beneath his coat. Not one of these names appeared in the file he'd taken from Capitol Hill. Not one of these families had received even a fraction of what the executive allocation summary had distributed to the well-dressed and well-connected. They had been told the country was healing, yet every letter told the same story. The wound was still open, and Washington had walked right past it. He stepped into the old Union Hall for shelter from the cold. It had once held 300 voices, shouting for fair wages, safety gear, and Sundays off. Now it was mostly dust and folded chairs. JD sat down at the long wooden table in the middle of the room. He laid the government file on one side and the stack of handwritten letters on the other. For a long time, he didn't move. He just looked back and forth, between ink and numbers, between what was legal and what was fair. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out one more note, smaller than the others, written in pencil on a torn grocery list. It simply said, "We don't want everything, just not nothing." JD closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he wasn't just holding a file, he was holding a choice. 2 days later, JD found himself in the stone hallways of an old law school building, tucked between ivy and memory. He had requested a quiet meeting, nothing formal, just a conversation with someone who knew the rules better than he ever wanted to. Professor Daniel Everett had taught legal ethics for nearly 3 decades. He was sharp, unsentimental, and known for being a purist when it came to the line between what could be done and what should be done. JD had respected him as a student. Now as a senator, he came back not for approval, but for clarity. They sat in a small conference room, sunlight slicing through thick windows. JD laid the folder out on the table without a word. Everett adjusted his glasses and flipped through it, page by page. He didn't react, didn't ask questions, just read. After 10 minutes, he leaned back and let out a quiet breath. "Well," he said, "this isn't illegal." JD looked up from his clasped hands. "Not even close?" Everett shrugged. "Executive disbursements under emergency clauses? Loophole city. You'd need 10 committees to even define misuse. The money didn't go to offshore accounts. No forged signatures, just policy applied with precision, technically defensible." JD said nothing. Everett continued. "If you're asking whether anyone's going to jail for this, no. If you're asking whether this is immoral, well," he tapped the folder, "this is greed, fully legalized, carefully structured, and approved in triplicate." JD looked at the spreadsheet again, as if seeing it with new eyes. The numbers were still there, still sickening, still real, but now they were coded in something worse than corruption: permission. "So," JD asked quietly, "we legalized betrayal and called it policy." The professor didn't answer. He didn't need to. JD leaned back in his chair. His thoughts weren't in the room anymore. They were back in Chillicothe. He thought of the retired welder's note. "My mortgage is $700. I got $600. He thought of the mother of 2, still drowning in debt, watching headlines on a broken TV that told her she'd been rescued. He remembered the names in the folder, those who had never stepped foot in Chillicothe, never worn steel-toed boots, never worked a night shift, people who flew into summits on private jets and left with briefcases full of policy wins. And now he understood. This wasn't oversight. This was design. Everett closed the folder gently and pushed it back toward JD. "You came here for truth," he said. "That's it. No violation. Just a system doing exactly what it was built to do. Nothing more." JD stood slowly, folder in hand. The room felt heavier somehow. "Thank you, Professor." Everett gave a slow nod. "You're going to do something with that, aren't you?" JD didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was louder than any yes. As he walked out into the courtyard, the wind had picked up. A few pages of old student flyers danced across the bricks. The law school bell rang faintly in the distance, marking the hour with disinterest. JD paused beneath the archway, folder still under his arm, and looked up at the sky. Gray again, just like in Chillicothe. The system hadn't broken. It had functioned exactly as intended, and now he had to decide whether to expose it or be complicit in its silence. JD sat alone in his car in the Senate parking garage, the manila folder still resting on the passenger seat beside him. The edges were beginning to curl. He hadn't opened it since the meeting with Everett, but the weight of it hadn't left his chest. The professor had given him clarity, but not peace. He stared at the contacts list on his phone for a long time before finding her name, Marlene Holt. She was never a donor, never someone who made headlines, but he remembered her clearly. A widow, former nurse, her late husband, Carl Holt, had worked 30 years in the steel mills of southern Ohio. Never took a sick day, never complained. JD had met her once during his campaign, an unassuming woman with a quiet voice and a spine like steel. She hadn't asked for a favor. She just asked if anyone in Washington still knew how to listen. He tapped the screen. The phone rang 3 times before her voice came on, calm and steady, like she'd been expecting it. "Well now," she said, not asking who it was. "I figured I'd hear from you again." "Hi, Marlene," JD said. "Do you have a minute?" "I've got all the time in the world, Senator. That's what happens when the work runs out, but the bills don't." He exhaled softly, watching the light blink across the dashboard. "I wanted to ask you something. About Carl." She didn't speak for a moment, then gently, "You found something, didn't you?" JD hesitated. "A folder. Names. Numbers. Companies that took money meant for people like you. Like him. Like all of Chillicothe. It's not illegal, but it's everything that's wrong." "I'm not surprised," she said. "Carl wouldn't have been either." "I don't know what to do with it yet," JD admitted. "I know if I bring this out, they'll come after me. Discredit it. Call it politics." "You think this isn't political already?" she said, her voice firm now. "Carl gave them 30 years of his back, his lungs, his knees. And when he died, they sent me a benefits packet that looked like a discount coupon book. So no, don't talk to me about politics. You want to know what to do? Don't save me, son. Just make sure someone listens this time." JD closed his eyes. That last sentence stayed with him. Not shouted, not pleaded, just said plainly, like truth often is. She continued, her tone softening. "He wasn't asking to be famous, JD. He just wanted to know that when he was gone, someone would remember what it cost him to live the way he did, that maybe his name would still matter somewhere." JD didn't speak. He couldn't. Not right away. She added one more thing. "You've got the voice now, the cameras, the microphone. That folder's not just paper. It's a ledger, a history book they didn't want written. Don't let them burn it before it's read." He nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Thank you, Marlene." "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "Just the truth." They ended the call. JD sat in the stillness, the phone resting in his hand. Then he turned slowly toward the folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what it contained. And now he also knew what it demanded. Not a hero, not a savior. Just someone who would make sure the forgotten were finally heard. The folder now sat on JD Vance's desk like a loaded weapon, sealed but humming with weight. He had read it cover to cover 3 times. Every line, every number, every name had been triple-checked. His notes were organized, his facts sharp. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. He didn't need more time. What he needed now was sunlight. By 8 a.m., his communications director, Ellis, was already at the office. She had barely taken her coat off when JD handed her the draft press release. "We go wide with this. Today." Ellis scanned the title, Undisclosed Executive Disbursements under the APR Act, a call for transparency. Her eyes flicked down the bullet points. Each one was a dagger. Undeniable payouts to executive names attached to recent factory closures, lobbying ties, and in one case, a company under investigation for procurement fraud. She looked up at JD, her voice low. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll prepare the submission to the Senate Media Office for clearance." By noon, the press release had been submitted to the standard internal review system. Just a formality in theory. JD was a sitting senator. He had every right to address the public. But by 2 o'clock, Ellis returned to his office with a paper in her hand and something colder in her eyes. They blocked it. JD looked up slowly. What? They flagged it as unverified and potentially inflammatory. He stared at her. We sent them source files, linked names to federal disbursement records. What part is unverified? Ellis shrugged. Apparently, the phrase executive abuse of relief funds implies intent. They want us to revise or remove. No, she sat down, voice firm now. JD, you don't understand. The moment we release this outside the official channel, you become the story. They'll call it political sabotage, distraction. You'll be accused of cherry-picking data. These are powerful names, connected names. He leaned back, jaw tight. So we're protecting the feelings of billionaires while people back home are rationing insulin? Ellis didn't answer. She just stared at him, expression caught between loyalty and fear. Then another voice chimed in. Noah, JD's senior policy advisor, who had been silent until now. He stood near the door, arms folded, face pale. It'll vanish in 24 hours, JD, he said. Or we will. JD turned to him. What's that supposed to mean? It means if we release this recklessly, we lose control of the narrative. They'll twist it, drown it, dismiss it. And when it doesn't land, when it gets buried, you'll lose the only real shot we have at accountability. JD stood up slowly, walked to the window. Outside, the Capitol dome gleamed as if it had something to be proud of. People walked by on sidewalks with coffee cups and clipboards, never looking up. He thought of Marlene's voice in his ear. Don't let them burn it before it's read. He turned back. We revise the release, remove nothing, soften nothing. But if they won't let us use the official channels, Ellis cut in. You'll need another way, a bigger stage, and it can't come from us. It has to be live, immediate, undeniable. JD nodded. Then that's what we do. Noah hesitated. You're risking everything. I know, JD said. So are they. They just don't know it yet. He walked back to his desk, placed the folder inside a new envelope. This time it wasn't going into a file cabinet. It was going where it couldn't be ignored, because if the system refused to speak the truth, he would find a way to speak it louder. The first call came at 6:42 p.m. JD was in his office alone, reviewing a draft version of the speech his team had helped him rework, one that might accompany the document should he choose to release it during a televised hearing or a summit. It was strategic, focused, and still careful. Too careful, he thought. The screen of his personal phone lit up. Unknown caller. He answered out of instinct. A familiar voice came through the line. Calm, confident, lined with the kind of charm that had bought silence for decades. Evening, son, the man said. Been a while. JD recognized the voice immediately. Calder Webb, longtime party donor, strategist, and the kind of man who always called from nowhere, but somehow knew everything. I hear you've been digging, Calder said, finding things that don't belong to you. JD didn't respond. He waited. You always had a spine, Calder continued. That's why we backed you. Ohio liked your story, your scars. But this isn't your fight. JD leaned back in his chair, watching the sun dip past the rooftops outside his window. You calling to tell me that before or after you try to stop me? There was a pause, not long, just long enough to feel deliberate. I'm calling to remind you how this works. You shine a light too bright in the wrong direction, and the whole room gets burned, including you. You're making enemies, son. JD smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. If they're enemies now, maybe they were never friends. Another pause. Then Calder's voice dropped, quiet and slow. You want to win Ohio again? This isn't the way. You want to keep your staff safe, your name intact? Then fold the folder, close the door, and let it go. JD stood, walked slowly toward the window. Below, staffers left for the day, unaware that upstairs the room had just turned cold. You know what this file is, Calder? JD asked. It's not a leak. It's not a stunt. It's a map. A list of who got rich while places like Chillicothe got hollowed out. And nobody cares, Calder replied, voice hardening. Not really. Not when the next election cycle kicks in. Voters forget. Press moves on. But the people behind those numbers, they don't forget. And they don't forgive. Then came the part that hit different. Calder didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You won't win Ohio again, JD. And if you keep going like this, you won't be safe here either. The line went dead. JD stood in the silence, phone still in hand. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he turned, walked back to his desk, and opened the folder again. Not to study it, not even to remind himself what was inside, but simply to say in his own way, I'm still here. Across the room, the overhead light buzzed faintly. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere in the distance. But inside that office, there was only stillness. JD knew this wasn't just about policy anymore. This was power pulling its strings in the dark. And now that the curtain had been tugged back, the only thing left was to decide, would he step away or step all the way in? The road to Green Hollow, West Virginia, wasn't on any tourist brochure. It curled between two worn hills, past rusted fences and pickup trucks on cinder blocks. JD had driven this stretch once before, years ago during the campaign, when every diner in Appalachia felt like a promise waiting to be kept. But this visit wasn't about shaking hands or giving sound bites. This was about listening. He pulled into the gravel lot behind Nellie's Diner just after 6. The sign out front had a few flickering letters, NELIES, brake stall DY, and a plastic flag whipped back and forth in the cold wind. Inside, it smelled like coffee that had been brewing since dawn and biscuits that came with more butter than flour. There were 6 people seated when he walked in, and all of them looked up. Some recognized him, none spoke. JD nodded, found an empty booth near the back, and waited. The waitress approached after a moment. She was maybe mid-40s, strong arms, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. No name tag, just tired eyes that had seen too much and had no use for small talk. What'll it be? She asked. Just coffee, JD said, and maybe a quiet place to read. She raised an eyebrow, then noticed the envelope he'd placed beside the salt shaker. That's the list, ain't it? She asked plainly. JD blinked. You've heard about it? She leaned in slightly. My cousin works in the print room at the county building. He saw copies go through. Executive allocation summary, right? JD nodded. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron, unfolded it, and began to read aloud in a voice that didn't tremble. James Thatcher, Steel Corporation, $6.2 million. Karen Bates, Hale Tech Lobbying, $3.7 million. Douglas and Reed, $5.4 million. She looked back at him. These are the ones who eat first. JD didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. A minute later, an older man seated at the counter rose slowly, walked over. His coat was faded green, his boots scuffed, and his gait slightly uneven, a limp that didn't need explaining. A Vietnam vet. JD had met men like him before, men who saluted without needing a flag. The man didn't introduce himself. He just looked at JD, then at the list, and said in a low voice, We were never meant to see that list, Senator. JD swallowed. The man kept going. You think this is new? It's not. It's just the first time someone like you brought it to the table? Then he added almost kindly, That's why they're scared of you. JD wanted to respond, but again, there was nothing useful to say. Instead, the man turned and went back to his seat. The waitress poured him more coffee like nothing happened. JD sat back. Around him, the diner went on like usual. Plates clinked. A kid at the next booth played with a sugar packet. But underneath the hum of normalcy was something else. Not just awareness, resignation. The quiet understanding that what he had uncovered wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. They already knew. He just had proof now. JD reached into the envelope and took out a fresh copy of the summary. He left it on the table with his untouched coffee and a folded 20. As he stepped outside, the sky had turned the color of burnt silver. Cold wind tugged at his coat, but there was no hesitation in his step. The voices in that diner weren't angry. They were waiting. Now it was his move. The envelope was heavy, thicker stock, embossed seal, a faint sheen to the lettering that made it look more like a wedding invitation than a summons from Washington's highest office. It had been hand-delivered, not emailed. That alone told J.D. Vance it was meant to be seen and felt. He opened it in silence, sitting at the edge of his desk as early morning light crept through the blinds. The language was formal, polite, and carefully curated. The White House cordially invites Senator J.D. Vance to participate in the televised Economic Recovery Summit, hosted by President Joseph R. Biden, to discuss the measurable impact and bipartisan success of the American Prosperity Restoration Act. He read it again, then a third time. At the bottom, in smaller print, "Live broadcast. All comments on the record." Ellis burst into the room a minute later, hair still damp from rain and phone already ringing. "You saw it?" she asked. J.D. held it up. "They want to trap you," she said bluntly, not sitting. "The summit's just theater. They're going to showcase feel-good numbers, hand-pick business owners, maybe a veteran who got a $200 check and said thank you. You show up with that folder, and they'll paint you as hostile, opportunistic, out of step." J.D. didn't answer. He tapped the envelope against his palm slowly. His chief of staff, Noah, stepped in behind her, holding a laptop already loaded with headlines. "CNN's calling it a bipartisan victory moment. You walk in with accusations and they'll spin it like you're raining on the parade." Ellis nodded. "It's bait, J.D. A setup. They want to embarrass you." J.D. looked up at both of them, voice calm but certain. "Then let them try." Silence settled over the room. Ellis folded her arms. "We've worked hard to control the story. You do this. It won't be your stage." "I don't need it to be my stage," J.D. replied. "I just need a mic." He turned the invitation over in his hand once more. The weight of it wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just paper. It was pressure wrapped in formality, a chance to fold politely or to risk being publicly discredited. But he also knew something the White House didn't. The people back home weren't watching for press releases anymore. They were watching for someone who wouldn't flinch. "We prepare," he said, standing. "I want the full list cross-referenced with current corporate closures. Give me names they can't deny, and get me a copy that fits inside a folder small enough to slide under a podium if I have to." Noah raised a brow. "You're going to read it out loud?" "If I get the chance." Ellis paced for a moment, then finally let out a breath and nodded. "Okay, but if we do this, we don't blink. You'll get smeared, fact-checked in real time, interrupted, talked over. We'll lose allies." J.D. stepped past her toward the door. "Then we find new ones." He walked out of the office with the envelope still in hand, feeling the curve of the embossed presidential seal beneath his thumb. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. This summit wasn't a stage for reconciliation. It was a carefully staged performance designed to kill the conversation he had spent weeks building. But they'd made one mistake. They had invited him, and J.D. Vance was done playing polite. The East Room of the White House gleamed like a page torn from a magazine. Golden curtains, rows of flags, a semicircle of reporters pressed behind velvet ropes. The Economic Recovery Summit was designed with precision, every light angled, every backdrop coordinated. It was less a summit than a spectacle, and every camera was rolling. President Biden stepped up to the podium in his signature Navy suit, papers in hand, his voice warm and rehearsed. The teleprompter glowed gently before him. "Today," he began, "we mark a turning point. We've turned the page on crisis. The American Prosperity Restoration Act didn't just promise recovery, it delivered it." Applause, timed and full. He smiled modestly, paused, and continued. "Unemployment is at a record low. Small businesses are back. Wages are climbing. America," he said, "is standing tall again." More applause, louder this time. The camera panned to cabinet members nodding in unison. J.D. Vance sat in the second row, manila folder resting on his lap like a coiled spring. He didn't clap. He didn't blink. He waited. Biden moved into his closing. "Let's not forget what got us here. Bipartisan resolve, responsible spending, and shared sacrifice." Sacrifice. That was the word that broke the dam. J.D. stood, no note cards, no preamble, no smile. He stepped forward before his name was even called, walked up to the stage as the applause was still fading. One of the aides at the edge tried to intercept him. He brushed past. Biden turned, confused. "Senator Vance, the floor will be yours shortly." JD spoke directly into the mic. Calm, clear, cold. "I won't be long, Mr. President." He opened the folder with 2 fingers. The sound of the clasp echoed faintly in the room. He pulled out a single page, held it like a document of record. James W. Thatcher, Steel Corp Holdings, $6.2 million. Maria Hale, Hale Tech Lobbying, $3.7 million. Crossfield Energy, $6.9 million. Douglas and Reed Consulting, $5.4 million, a shuffle in the press row. Someone lowered their camera. John Carter, Vietnam veteran, Chillicothe, Ohio, $600. Silence. JD glanced up, scanning the room. No one moved. No severance, no bonus, no bailout, just a letter telling him the mill was closing and a check that didn't cover rent. He served this country. They served themselves. Biden opened his mouth but didn't speak. JD turned another page. These names, these numbers, they weren't in the press releases. They weren't shared in budget briefings. But they're real, and they were buried inside a file marked internal use only. A file I now have. The president shifted behind him. His advisors leaned in, whispering. JD continued. This wasn't relief. It was reward. For the connected. For the protected. While Americans were told to tighten belts, these names loosened theirs at our expense. He paused. In towns like Chillicothe, Meigs County, West Logan, they didn't turn the page on crisis. The page was torn out and sold. No one clapped. Not one person spoke. Even the press, trained to chase sound, held their breath. JD closed the folder slowly, returned it to his side. Then he stepped back from the mic. I was invited here today to celebrate the system, but I won't celebrate a system that forgets the very people it claims to rescue. He didn't look at the president. He didn't need to. He walked back to his seat, and in that room, brighter than truth, louder than truth, there was only one thing left. Silence. JD stood still, the manila folder now closed at his side, yet its weight lingered in the air like smoke after a shot. Across the stage, President Biden hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, equal parts caution and calculation, but his silence spoke more loudly than any rebuttal. The applause that had filled the room just moments earlier had vanished completely, as if someone had reached in and muted history mid-sentence. JD stepped forward once more, slower this time, not toward the podium, but just enough to look into the cameras now angled tightly toward him. He wasn't reading anymore. He wasn't listing figures. He was speaking plainly, personally, as if every viewer on the other end of the broadcast was sitting across from him in a kitchen booth. This, he said, voice low and steady, was called a recovery. He let the words hang there, let the cameras lean in. But for who? Another pause, the kind that made sound engineers hold their breath and press Secret Service agents lean forward in their earpieces. JD's eyes scanned the front row, not looking for applause but for honesty. And finding none, he turned back to Biden. His gaze didn't waver. You call it leadership, he continued, when billionaires receive millions and call it sacrifice. You call it success when towns like Hollow Ridge, like Chillicothe, like Dayton, get told they're better off with one gas station, no jobs, and a commemorative plaque. He took another step forward, gesturing gently with the envelope in his hand, not waving it, not slamming it, just holding it up like a truth that had been waiting too long to be seen. You say the crisis is over. I say the crisis just changed clothes. Murmurs flickered through the room, but no one interrupted him. Not yet. This list didn't fall from the sky. It didn't come from conspiracy. It came from inside the system, your system, a system that asks working Americans to be patient while it wires bonuses to the same executives who laid them off. He took a breath, not dramatic, just grounded. I didn't come here to destroy anything. I came here to remind everyone watching that a government which forgets the people who built its bridges, fought its wars, and raised its children is not a government worth applauding. The stillness deepened. The kind of stillness that wasn't empty, but heavy. Cameras clicked again, quietly. Notes stopped being taken. Even the White House media liaison at the back had stopped sending texts. JD turned again, not to Biden this time, but directly into the center camera, the one streaming the summit to millions of homes. "If this is what recovery looks like," he said, eyes unwavering, "then tell me, who did it help?" There was no answer. Not from the president, not from the aides, not from the press. Only one thing broke the silence. A whisper, soft but just loud enough to carry across the room from a reporter sitting in the third row, her pen paused above her notepad. "They'll never forget this moment," she said. And she was right, because sometimes a story doesn't need shouting. It needs stillness. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness that comes when truth finally walks into the room. The silence didn't last long. By the next morning, it had been replaced with noise. A flood of headlines, hot takes, and hostile sound bites that moved faster than the truth ever could. J.D. Vance's name wasn't just trending, it was being dissected, mocked, and weaponized. The New York Dispatch called it reckless theater masquerading as patriotism. One cable anchor laughed mid-segment. Vance read off some unverified spreadsheet like it was the Ten Commandments. "What's next, Senate seance?" Talk show hosts on both coasts piled on, turning his moment into a punchline. "Populist poison," said one. "A dangerous man with a dangerous voice," warned another. They replayed the clip of him holding the folder like it was a crime scene photo. The speech, stripped of context, was now paired with grainy B-roll of closed factories and shaky camera footage from small-town protests. Protests that hadn't even been about him, but suddenly felt like they were. Pundits debated whether he had betrayed decorum. Former colleagues, previously friendly off-camera, now called him a conspiracy theorist wrapped in a three-piece suit. And JD said nothing. He didn't call into the shows, didn't post a rebuttal on social media, didn't leak clarifications to friendly outlets. He let them talk, because he knew something most of them didn't. When you tell a hard truth, the first reaction isn't gratitude, it's fury. Inside his Senate office, the air was thick. His staff worked in whispers. Emails came in bursts. Reporters camped outside the building lobby, hoping for a quote, a stumble, even a sigh. "Vance is reckless," one political consultant told MSNBC. "He's throwing grenades into the establishment because he doesn't understand how fragile our democracy really is." But JD understood it better than they thought. He wasn't surprised by the backlash, just how fast it came. He could see the playbook unfolding in real time. Discredit, distract, disqualify. They weren't attacking the facts. They were attacking him. A week earlier, he had walked into the Economic Recovery Summit with a manila folder. Now people were questioning whether he even belonged in government at all. It wasn't just the media. Pressure came from places that didn't send push notifications, closed-door meetings, veiled suggestions from party insiders. Quiet warnings. Donors were uneasy, allies were distancing themselves, and there were better ways to raise concerns. But JD didn't care much for polite treason. He had seen the spreadsheet. He had walked the streets of Chillicothe. He had stood in rooms where the word recovery was an insult, not a policy. He knew exactly what he was doing. Still, late at night, alone in his office, he watched the clips. Not to second-guess himself, but to remember the moment it all shifted. He replayed the question he had asked into the lens. "If this is recovery, tell me, who did it help?" They hadn't answered. They still hadn't. He took a pen from his drawer and circled 3 words in his legal pad. They heard it, they hated it, but they couldn't unhear it. Outside, the reporters were still waiting, but inside, something quieter and more dangerous to his critics was taking root. He wasn't backing down. In a small living room just outside Dayton, Ohio, a 14-year-old girl sat cross-legged on the floor, phone in hand, laptop open, eyes wide. She'd watched the clip a dozen times already. J.D. Vance holding that beige folder like it weighed 100 pounds, reading out names and numbers with a voice that didn't crack, but nearly did. She didn't understand all of it. Not the Senate backdrop, not the economics. But she recognized one thing, her dad's name. Second column, 4th row down. There it was. Marcus W. Reddick, Iraq vet, $600. Her dad, who'd served 2 tours and come home with more scars than medals. Her dad, who now worked night shifts stocking shelves and hadn't paid the gas bill in 2 months. Her dad, who still stood every time the anthem played, even when he was alone. She turned on her phone's front camera. At first, she just filmed her laptop screen, paused on that line from JD's speech. But then she turned it back toward her, holding a finger against her father's name on the list. "My dad fought in Iraq," she said quietly. "He's jobless now. They gave him $600. 600. She paused. "They gave the bank CEO 6 million, but my dad got 600. Her voice shook, not with anger, but something more painful. Clarity. "He always said if you serve your country serves you back. I guess they lied to him." She didn't tag any politicians, didn't link to the full spreadsheet, just posted it to her private TikTok account with the caption, "Tell me this is fair." She never expected what came next. Within 4 hours, the video had over 500,000 views. By the end of the night, it passed 3 million. Celebrities began resharing it. Veterans commented by the thousands. Some uploaded videos of their own, reading off the list JD had exposed, one name after another, like a digital roll call of the forgotten. "She said what we all felt," one Marine vet posted. "She's 14, said another. "Why'd it take a kid to make them listen?" At 6:14 a.m. the next day, JD's chief of staff woke him up with a one-line text. "You need to see this girl's video." JD watched it in silence, sitting at the edge of his unmade hotel bed. When the video ended, he played it again. And again. Not because it shocked him, but because it didn't. This, he thought, was why he read the list out loud. Not for votes, not for noise, for her. Later that morning, the girl's father, Marcus, called a local news station that had reached out for comment. He didn't say much, just one line. "I didn't expect my daughter's heartbreak to be more powerful than all the senators in Washington." But it was. By that evening, the hashtag $600 was trending on every major platform. People began sharing their own numbers, writing their stories in Sharpie on cardboard signs, holding them up in videos, at rallies, even outside congressional offices. JD didn't need to respond to the backlash anymore. A 14-year-old had already done it for him. And unlike polished press conferences or partisan debates, her voice couldn't be spun. It couldn't be silenced. It didn't come from a party. It came from a kitchen table where dinner portions were getting smaller and futures were shrinking faster. She hadn't meant to go viral. She just wanted someone, anyone, to notice her dad. And now, the country had. The news broke at 6:42 a.m. J.D. Vance's district office in southern Ohio had been vandalized overnight. Windows shattered, spray painted across the brick wall in jagged red. Traitor. Inside, desks were overturned, phones smashed. The lobby flagpole snapped in half like a matchstick. The only thing untouched was a stack of printed spreadsheets, copies of the very same executive allocation summary he'd exposed days earlier. One had been duct taped to the wall with a note written over it in permanent marker. "You poked the bear. Now run." His staff evacuated the premises. No arrests were made. No cameras were allowed in, officially due to an ongoing investigation. But JD knew better. This wasn't just political retaliation. It was a warning. That same morning, across the country, something very different unfolded. In Iowa, a group of retired veterans printed out JD's list on a gas station printer and taped it to the door of the local post office. By noon, 4 more towns in the area had done the same. They weren't organized. They didn't need to be. The list spoke for itself. In Mississippi, a single mother printed the spreadsheet and taped it to her car window. She wrote over it, "You gave us crumbs. Now we give you names." In Montana, a line of 18-wheelers rolled down a rural highway, each flying a homemade flag, not of a political party, but of names. Names from JD's list. Names of Americans who got $600 while billion-dollar firms cashed blank checks. On the side of one truck, painted in thick white brushstroke letters, "We remember who got what." Reporters began calling it the list that walked. It started as a spreadsheet, but now it was pinned to diner walls, printed on bumper stickers, even laser-etched into wooden signs hung on barns. Some just taped it up with handwritten headlines like, "Read, Weep, Share." JD stayed mostly quiet through the chaos. He issued no statement about the vandalism, not even when asked directly on camera. Instead, he released a single sentence on his official congressional feed. "If a window breaks, but the truth stands, I'll take the truth." In back rooms of DC, panic started to set in, not because JD was still speaking, but because he no longer had to. A movement had been set loose, and it didn't need a podium. It had post offices, truck beds, teenagers, veterans, nurses, janitors, school teachers, all asking the same thing: where did the money go? For every senator who dismissed the backlash as misinformation, a new face from a forgotten town popped up online, holding up a printed page and pointing to a name. "That's my brother. That's my dad. That's me." By Friday, over 400 towns had seen the list printed or shared in their local communities. Not all were angry. Some were just quiet. Quiet the way grief is. In northern Pennsylvania, someone slid a laminated copy into the church bulletin board under the words, "This is your neighbor." Back in Ohio, JD returned to his vandalized office alone. No aides, no press, just silence and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. He reached into a drawer, still intact beneath the wreckage, and pulled out a folded American flag that had been mailed to him months ago by a veteran's widow. She'd written, "Don't let them forget him." He unfolded it slowly, then walked outside and raised it on a temporary pole his staff had installed hours earlier. The stars rippled in the wind. Across the street, a teenage boy stopped on his bike. He looked at JD, then at the building, scarred but standing, and quietly saluted. JD didn't wave back. He simply looked up at the flag and whispered, "They won't." The chamber was half lit, as if unsure whether it was meant to host a formality or a reckoning. 6 senators sat scattered around the long mahogany dais. Cameras were live, but the gallery was nearly empty. No aides, no corporate representatives, no invited CEOs, and no apologies. JD Vance adjusted the microphone in front of him, the only sound in the room a faint mechanical hum from the C-SPAN feed. He looked left, then right, then directly into the camera lens. "This hearing," he began, "was not supposed to happen." He paused, letting the words settle. "But when a spreadsheet goes viral and truckers across the country are pasting it on their rigs, you no longer get to pretend it's a footnote." Behind him, an aide placed 6 white chairs along the opposite wall, each labeled with a bold placard, "CEO, JAVELINAEROSPACE PACIFICCHEMTECHCEO, Lannister Energy, CEO, Resem Financial CEO, Blue Valley Defense, CEO, National Health Enterprises. All had received over $200 million in emergency economic relief. Not one had sent a representative. JD stood and walked to the first chair. "Mr. Stanley W. Cutter," he said clearly, "your company reported record profits in the quarter you accepted taxpayer money. You paid out bonuses while laying off 12% of your workforce. I invited you to explain that." He moved to the next. "Ms. Elena Park, National Health Enterprises. The spreadsheet shows your board received a $6 million payout during the same week your company closed 2 clinics in rural Arkansas. I asked you here to speak to those patients. You declined." Chair by chair, name by name, he called them into the record, not expecting an answer, but refusing to let their absence be silent. Each statement landed like a gavel strike. In the back, a woman from the Associated Press live-tweeted every line. On TikTok, viewers stitched JD's speech over images of shuttered plants and empty storefronts. In less than 10 minutes, the hearing began trending under hashtag 6emptychairs. One senator leaned over to whisper, "What's the point of calling names to an empty room?" JD didn't blink. Because America's watching, and they know what it means when power doesn't even bother to show up. He returned to his seat, adjusted his notes, and glanced briefly at a printed copy of the spreadsheet folded neatly beside his water glass. At the top in red ink, someone had scribbled, "Not forgotten." He cleared his throat and continued, "I've been told this is political, that I'm grandstanding, that I'm making noise. But if your job vanished while someone else's stock options doubled, Maybe a little noise is the least we owe you." There was no applause, no dramatic outbursts, just a pause, deep and quiet, as the camera panned slowly across the 6 chairs. One by one, Americans watching from living rooms, gas stations, break rooms, and phone screens saw exactly what JD wanted them to see: absence, silence, indifference. Then he closed the hearing with a line not in his notes. "To every working family who felt invisible, today someone said your name into the record, and that means it can never be erased." He stood, collected his folder, and walked out without another word. The next morning, a photo of the 6 chairs, empty, glaring, undeniable, ran front page in USA Today with the headline, "The Hearing That Spoke Without Them." The day after the Senate hearing, something strange happened. Not on Capitol Hill, not in the White House briefing room, but in a dusty print shop just outside Pittsburgh, where a union foreman named Dennis Roth walked in with a folded piece of paper. On that paper was a screenshot of J.D. Vance standing beside 6 empty chairs, each bearing the name of a corporate executive. Dennis pointed to the screen and said, "Put that on a shirt, big across the back. Front pocket, just 6 words. I'm not on that list." The clerk looked up. "You mean, like proud?" "No," Dennis said. "Like I should have been, because I worked 32 years and they gave me $600 damn. By sunset, the first run of 100 shirts was gone, then 500, then 5,000. They shipped to rural Indiana, factory towns in Michigan, shipyards in Louisiana. Truckers wore them like badges. Teachers wore them to school. A bus driver in Kansas posted a photo with the caption, "I wasn't seen, but now I'm counted." Meanwhile, in Mississippi, a single mother named Trina built something slower, but deeper. Behind her church, in a patch of grass between 2 oaks, she drove a wooden stake into the ground. Then another, then 6 more. On each, she nailed a small white sign, "To those who got $600 and still stood proud." Each week, a new stake appeared. Some bore names. Others just read, "For my dad," or "She never complained." Local news tried to spin it as an anti-Biden protest, but Trina corrected them. "This isn't about the president, it's about presence. These are people who held families together with $600 and no help. That deserves a place." By the time national media noticed, the makeshift memorial had become a gathering place. A quiet one. No chants, no speeches, just stories left behind in folded paper notes and laminated pay stubs. One read, "Worked through the pandemic. Got COVID, lost my job. Still showed up for my mom's chemo every week. $600 bought 4 tanks of gas." In New Mexico, a mural went up. 6 silhouettes standing shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by headlines crossed out in red paint. "Economy strong again. Recovery complete. Americans back to work." In their place, handwritten scrawls, "Still waiting. I was never gone. Don't forget the ones who stood quietly." Somewhere in D.C., a pollster stared at shifting data. Approval numbers dipped. Trust in economic reporting plummeted. But they missed the point, because what was changing couldn't be measured in margins or media cycles. It was something slower, quieter. In a grocery store line, someone would murmur, "Did you see the hearing?" A stranger would nod. "Yeah, I saw the chairs." And that was it. No outrage, no explosion. Just the soft, certain weight of recognition. In the back of his home office, J.D. Vance kept a stack of letters growing by the day. Some were angry, some grateful. Most were tired, but one, scribbled in ballpoint pen, stuck out. It was from a high school custodian in Iowa. "Don't know if this changes anything, but it felt like, for the first time, someone read a number out loud, and it was me." That night, J.D. stood at his window, the city lights behind him, and whispered, "They're rewriting the headlines now." Not with ink, not with power, but with presence. The letter came in a plain white envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just tucked beneath the door of J.D. Vance's Capitol office early one morning. His staff had left the night before to avoid the cameras still hovering outside. He had stayed late, again, reading through more names from the spreadsheet that had refused to die. He found it the next morning, after a restless night and a bitter cup of office coffee. The handwriting on the front was careful, almost hesitant. Inside, the note was short, only 2 lines. I read every name. My brother was there. Thank you, no signature. No plea. Just that. J.D. stood there a long time, the letter shaking slightly in his hand. He didn't know why it hit harder than the speeches, harder than the backlash, harder than the call from the president's office warning him to let it go. He whispered to the empty room, "That's why we do this. Not for headlines, not for the polls, but for that." He sat down at his desk, the light outside still soft and gray, and stared at the copy of the list, the one he'd started reading weeks ago, the one that refused to vanish. He ran his finger down the names again. He didn't know which one was her brother. Didn't need to, because now every name had a shadow behind it. A mother, a daughter, a grieving friend. A girl who stayed up late reading a list just to find the only proof her brother had existed in someone else's version of the truth. Across the country, the echo hadn't stopped. In Kansas City, a diner owner offered free meals to anyone who brought a printed copy of The List. In Vermont, a retired librarian read every name aloud over the local radio at midnight. Quiet, measured, like a candle vigil carried by voice. Back in D.C., J.D.'s own Senate colleagues were split, some cold, some curious, and a few beginning to ask for private copies of the spreadsheet. Not because we agree, one admitted, but because we need to see who we forgot. That same afternoon, J.D. walked the halls of Congress alone. No press, no statement, just thinking. At the entrance to the Capitol Rotunda, he paused beneath the dome. The marble echoed with the distant footsteps of tourists and interns. He pulled the note from his coat pocket and stared at it again. He imagined her brother, not just as a name, but as a person. Maybe he was the factory worker from Ohio whose plant never reopened. Maybe the Navy vet from Arizona who got $600 in a "thank you for your service" email. Or maybe the janitor who kept the hospital floors clean during the worst of it, only to be let go when the funding ran dry. The system had offered them silence. J.D. had offered their names, and someone had read every one of them. He folded the note slowly and tucked it into the inside pocket of his suit, right above his heart. Then he looked up into the echoing ceiling above. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was a line he would never forget, because one voice had found a brother in a sea of bureaucracy, and sometimes that was enough. He turned back toward his office, his steps steady, the hall still whispering with the sound of names too long ignored. The building smelled of fresh paint and old resolve. J.D. Vance stood just inside the new public library in Middletown, Ohio, his hometown, watching families file past shelves of donated books and locally carved wooden benches. It wasn't the grandest library in the state, but it had something no other did. In the far corner, beneath a sign made of salvaged steel, hung a simple plaque. The payroll they tried to hide. It wasn't flashy, no screens, no bold headlines. Just a corkboard map of the United States with pins of red, blue, and gold. Each pin marked a town named in the spreadsheet, a town where someone received $600 while executives took millions, a town that sent a letter, a town that stood up. The first pin was already there. J.D. had quietly placed it that morning. Middletown. He watched as an older man with grease-stained hands approached the board with a hesitant look. He reached into his flannel shirt pocket, pulled out a gold pin, and placed it near the border of Kentucky. Then, almost whispering, he said to no one in particular, "That's my town." A mother followed, pushing a stroller. Her toddler held a red pin tightly, then giggled as she helped guide it into the heart of West Virginia. "That's where Grandma still lives," the mother said softly, "and where she got left behind." By the end of the day, the map looked like a patchwork quilt of pain and pride. Each pin wasn't just geography, it was testimony. Local news cameras tried to spin it as a political stunt, but they couldn't make it stick, because no speeches were made, no sides declared, only stories quietly honored. A man from Toledo placed a blue pin and said nothing, but he left a note on the small table nearby. "They said we were lazy. This pin says otherwise." Teenagers who once joked that nothing ever happened in Middletown now gathered around the map on lunch breaks. Some took selfies, others just stared. The librarian noticed they lingered longest over the handwritten tags clipped beneath the map. Each tag bore a quote from the hearings. One in particular kept drawing fingers. "Tell me who that helped." JD stood at the back, unnoticed. He didn't need a spotlight. The map was loud enough. The pins had become their own language, a quiet reckoning in the heart of the Rust Belt. And the wall? It wasn't just memory. It was proof they had not been invisible after all. The television glowed quietly in the corner of the diner. It was midday in Middletown, and the lunch crowd had thinned to just a few voices and the gentle clink of forks. No one said much when the news anchor announced the segment, "President Biden's first sit-down interview since the recovery list hearings." Behind the counter, the cook lowered the volume on the radio and turned up the screen. J.D. Vance sat in a booth alone, a coffee gone cold in front of him. He didn't flinch when Biden's face filled the screen. The president looked older. He wore a navy suit but no tie, and his eyes carried a weight no teleprompter could soften. The interviewer leaned in gently. "Mr. President, do you believe the relief program failed?" There was a pause, long enough to fill the room with silence. Biden exhaled slowly. "Maybe we missed something," he said. "Maybe we trusted too many of the wrong people. Maybe we thought numbers were enough and forgot the names behind them." A waitress stopped mid-pour at a nearby table. A man in overalls stared up from his sandwich. Even the cook leaned in with arms crossed. The interviewer pressed again, softer this time. "Do you regret it?" Biden looked down for a moment. "I regret what it cost them," he said, "and I regret not seeing it sooner." The screen cut to a montage, clips of hearings, pins on maps, factory gates closing. JD didn't speak. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just watched. The waitress came by to warm his cup. "That must mean something, right?" she asked, voice hopeful. JD looked up, gently shook his head, and replied quietly, "It means they finally heard the echo." But the voice came long before. The television moved on. New stories, new noise. But in that booth for a brief second, it felt like time had paused. Not to celebrate, not to forgive, but to acknowledge. Not every fight ends with a headline. Some just end with someone saying, "Maybe we were wrong," and sometimes that's enough. The envelope was plain, no return address, no seal, just a quiet name written in blue ink. Marlene Bledsoe. JD had written it himself, slowly, as if each stroke mattered. Inside was the list, the one they tried to bury, the one that now hung in truck stops and school gymnasiums across America, the one that had become more than numbers. He included a note, folded once, hand sign. "Marlene, I didn't forget. I don't know if this fixes anything. I don't know if anything can. But your name is there, on page 17, line 143. It's not bolded, it's not underlined, but it's real. And maybe, just maybe, someone will see it and stop scrolling. This was never about winning. It was about making sure they saw your name." JD. He sealed the letter and walked it to the mailbox himself, not trusting anyone else to deliver it. Outside, the wind swept through the Ohio morning like it had something to say. JD paused at the corner, staring up at a flag that fluttered against the gray sky. No cameras, no crowds, no applause. But something shifted. Not in the halls of power, but in the stillness of a single act finished right. One last name, and with it, a promise finally kept. This story reminds us that the biggest truths often whisper, not shout. J.D. Vance's quiet stand wasn't just about exposing numbers. It was about restoring names, dignity, and forgotten voices. In a world flooded with noise, sometimes the most powerful act is refusing to look away. Even if justice comes late, it still matters. Question for you. Have you ever felt unseen by the systems meant to protect you? What name, yours or someone else's, still deserves to be heard? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.